I'm Richard Rossiter from B4. So good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's session where we've got Steve Cook joining us. Steve, you there?
Hi guys. Hi Richard, how are you?
I'm fine, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much.
Brilliant. So I was introduced to Steve a few months ago, probably about 6 months ago now, by Grant. I think it was originally that Steve was introduced to me through, and Steve and I spent a lot of hours around the B4 table speculating about what we could do as a business going forward, and gradually got onto some similar themes about what we thought business should look like in the future, and presented to a rather, I wouldn't say mesmerised, sort of, I don't know quite what the word is, Steve. We had a team of B4 members around the table that we did a presentation to, which I think was, bewildering, I think. It was maybe a little bit ahead of its time, a little bit beyond us, but it was certainly unearthed some interesting patterns of thought. And Steve, perhaps you could give everybody some insight into who you are, what you do, and what we're going to be talking about today.
Okay, so I'm Steve Cook. I'm a strategist, whatever that means. That's my title. Notionally, I'm a brand strategist, but some years ago I lost the B word because nobody really understood what that meant beyond branding. So I'm a strategist. My business is called V, which stands for flicking the V's, the accepted way of doing things. And my trade has always been centered around what's become an increasingly dirty word, purpose. And how organisations conduct themselves and how organisations affect change.
Brilliant. Well, you touched on the two key words that hopefully we're going to talk about in depth a lot today: purpose and change. And for those of you that saw, that's fine, Tim. You're always late. No, you're not. That's normally my role. It's for those of you who got my message yesterday, referencing Steve's article on LinkedIn last night. If you haven't managed to have a read of it, please do check it out after the session today, or when you've got a spare 10 minutes. It's very in-depth, but very eye-opening, and centers around Steve's thoughts on change. So purpose then, Steve. Let's talk about purpose and what you see as purpose in a business. Is purpose for a business necessary? What role does purpose have for Oxfordshire as a county?
Okay, well, I think purpose, as I mentioned earlier, has become something of a dirty word. It's gone through various sort of cycles over the years in terms of people wanting it, people liking it. It's one of those words, maybe a bit like innovation, that started out well, then sort of got hijacked and became perhaps something to do with marketing or something to do with communication and spin, rather than what I think it was originally, and certainly the way I consider it. It is the stuff of an organisation. It is the reason why we exist. It is how we do things around here. It is the way that we conduct ourselves. And ultimately, it's what we want to deliver to the world one way or another. That could be through customers. It could be, increasingly, we're talking about purpose in ways that really haven't been in the mainstream for some time, in terms of contribution to the greater good and contribution to society. So if we think about what corporate purpose could be, the responsible business, a business that is perhaps more than profit. These are really big things that people have been talking about for some time. But I would argue that if you're a business who's struggling to make profits in the first place, then the concept of engineering yourselves to be more than profits could be very problematic. And so I think we need to bring a word that's been used all over the place back into the heartland of something that all businesses should be able to engage with and in, to not consider it as simply a marketing message, a piece of marketing comms or the gloss, and to start using purpose once defined as something that can orchestrate the way they think about everything to do with their organisations.
And we were talking before coming on today about defining a purpose for Oxfordshire as a whole. How would you go about doing that?
Well, that's a really big one, isn't it? That cuts to the conversation that we had and the presentation that we did towards the end of last year. Look, for those that don't know, and I think most people on here perhaps know me, but I've been wandering around the countryside in Oxfordshire wearing my hat for about 4 years now, just sort of looking at the county, looking at how it operates, looking at how it works, and starting to try and formulate some views about how Oxfordshire society could develop. I'm just a lone voice in that, but I do believe that every organisation, be they a business or a social enterprise or anything to do with governance within the county, B4 a great example of this, has a role to play and should increasingly have a voice in the way the county changes. The ideas that we shared towards the end of last year about change in Oxfordshire, you touched on it maybe a bit earlier, perhaps a little bit ahead of their time. And I think that at the time, there were a lot of conversations inside and outside Oxfordshire, a lot of conversations globally, about really big systemic change, big organisational change in the way that society operates. I think, rightly or wrongly, that those conversations were excellent and there were really good people having those conversations, but that they didn't really touch the mainstream. They didn't really touch everybody in the county. And so perhaps last November, we were presenting ideas that were beyond belief, but they were also talking to an audience perhaps who at that time saw no need to change in the main. Everything was broadly speaking okay. Whereas now I think we're in a world where, because of COVID, let's tell it how it is, because of COVID, I think a lot of what was being discussed before has now really accelerated and come to the centre. And maybe now the questions that were being asked in the margins are now being asked by more and more people, individually and interdependently in society. So for Oxfordshire, as with any organisation, one of the big things about change is having a look at the historic and existing structures, the history of an organisation or a place. And I can't help but think of Oxfordshire as an organisation. It's just much more complicated than many. Start to look at that and start to ask really big questions about whether the hierarchical, binary and systemic way that the county has been organised in the past is actually fit for future purpose. And I don't think it is, and I've said that for some time. The big question is, what do you do about it? And at the risk of going on a diatribe, there was something that we shared with people during that presentation last year, which was a Venn diagram. I love Venn diagrams. And the Venn diagram asked if anybody in Oxfordshire, on their own as an organisation, was big enough or impartial enough or liberated enough to affect the sort of change that we were starting to describe during that presentation. And of course, the short answer was no, because the organisations that are big enough aren't often impartial enough, and they're certainly not liberated enough. And as I mentioned in that presentation, I'm liberated enough, but I'm not big enough. I'm also impartial enough. So the conclusion was to hit the sweet spot in the centre of the Venn diagram, to create an environment where you had a collection of people that between them were big enough and impartial enough and liberated enough, that you could start to really think about change in a systemic way, in the way that I think a lot of people are now starting to think of it. I will share with you, I won't name names, I think there is one organisation in Oxfordshire that could actually be the closest to that sweet spot. And I'm talking with them about exactly that at the moment. There is one organisation. But the point is that if you follow a logic that says every business, every social enterprise, every charity should play a much richer and fuller part in the development of their own county in Oxfordshire, then how do you do that? B4 are playing a part in that at the moment, and that's great. But there needs to be the reason why, and that then cuts back to purpose. As I said in the piece last night, lots of organisations try and engage in iterative change, and I describe that as being a bit like herding cats, because there is no galvanising, binding, powerful and compelling and equitable reason to do it. So a leader can say, yeah, we're going to make big sweeping changes, and nothing ever happens. In fact, I was talking to somebody yesterday who said they actually left a major corporate because of the number of big sweeping changes that corporate tried to make, which failed, which then led to all sorts of things to do with fatigue and real mistrust and so on. So without purpose, I don't believe any organisation, be they Oxfordshire or the smallest business, can really understand how it should start to evolve itself. It's as simple as that. The way that you engineer purpose, and Grant, if you're there on this talk, you'll understand this, but the way you engineer purpose is actually a great deal more complicated than finding out what your number one best thing to offer the market is, and then coming up with some sexy ways of saying it. There's more to it. Anyway, there we are. So I think Oxfordshire is in need of massive change. I don't know exactly what that change should look like, but I think there are some stakeholders that have been engaged in the past who are great, and there are others that haven't, but all of them can come together. There just needs to be a binding and galvanising reason to do it that trumps everything else, and most certainly trumps the steady state.
And we just come off the back of a webinar with the City Council, the County Council and Oxfordshire LEP, and we had a briefing meeting yesterday before the session talking about how a lot of things that were being mooted to bring in that were maybe going to be tricky to bring in, things like congestion charge and parking levy. Now's the time to bring them in while people are receptive to change. Well, the sort of change you're talking about, the deep lying change that relies on more than just a handful of us agreeing with what you and a lot of us agree should be brought about, maybe is now, but how do we capture everybody's attention when a lot of businesses are fighting for survival, a lot of people worried about loved ones struggling health-wise? How do we galvanise that spirit into one collective?
I think you need to engage people and give them agency. I don't believe that communication in the county per se has been that great. I think a lot of organisations who are great and wonderful in every regard, I keep saying this, there are many, many brilliant organisations out there, but I wonder whether their ability to communicate and coagulate in a new way is there. And I think now is exactly the moment. You are right. I would consider things like congestion charge and so on as being important things, but I would also consider them to be sort of tactical. And that's a bit of a blasé way of saying it. But I think that's the sort of iterative change that says, okay, well, we need to fix that bit. We need to fix that bit. We need to fix that bit. But underneath it all the usual issues and challenges that the county faces are all there. So when I went to, and I'll share this with anybody that's on this talk, I went to an Inclusivity Commission seminar in January before the lockdown, where there were all of the discussions around the strategies that exist in the county that are being created by whoever, Oxlep and the Oxfordshire Strategic Partnership and so on. And they're all fantastic. They're all imperatives. They're all absolutely right and proper. But right at the very end of that, somebody, I won't name them, but somebody said, oh, and by the way, we're thinking of a social charter. And I thought, and I went away and I sat at a table with various people to discuss long-term strategy. And one of the key points was, well, surely, before you define any true strategies for anything, it doesn't matter what it is, you need to define why you need to create those strategies. And that better influences not only each of those strategies, but how they knit together more effectively. The really big word that was missing from all of it was agency. How do you create agency within a population of, what, 680,000 people, where you can't engage with everybody, but you can start to create what I call groundswell, I'm not alone in that, and you can start to do that, get people engaged on small community levels, but also therefore on the wider Oxfordshire base. But you need to have a governance for that, and I'm not saying it's by the usual current governance, but you need to have a way of governing that brings in all of those thoughts and actually makes sense of them so that you create that equity that's required. And again, it cuts to purpose and it cuts to vision. I'm sure there are many visions for the future of Oxfordshire. I'm sure the great and the good have sat around and said, yep, what we need to do is this, and we need to dial up that and dial down that and bring that in and so on. But as we pointed out during that talk, I believe Oxfordshire and everybody in it should be judged on how they have resolved the challenges that Oxfordshire faces and resolve those challenges by effecting change that is pretty much ubiquitous. And that we should be judged on that much more than all the things that we're currently held up high in high esteem for, because that's the more valuable thing. Let's lead change. Let's lead societal change. Now, I know we're moving way beyond purpose for an individual business, and not every individual business can sit there and think, right, I'm going to adopt a higher purpose and change the world. That they still want to put food on the table, and that's absolutely valid. But if you look at the way businesses in the past and today have affected change, whilst also growing their more than profit, or whatever you want to call it, status, whilst also making money, is huge. I always use John Deere as the example of this. John Deere way back was a guy who just happened to have an idea to make a different sort of plough blade that would help farmers, would make their lives easier. Cut to, and that was in I'm not too sure exactly when, but mid-1850s. Cut to the late 1920s, and the shit hit the fan, the Great Depression struck. And John Deere, by then a big company, famous for agricultural machinery, made a tacit decision that farmers wouldn't have to pay back the loans that they had got or give back their farm machinery that they'd had on tick. Now, it nearly broke John Deere. Whether they made that decision consciously because they wanted to be a more than profit business, or just they wanted to help out. Maybe it's just as benign as that. Maybe it was a deliberate decision that says, right, we're going to grow our customer base through loyalty by making sure that they can carry on ploughing even though they haven't paid for their machinery. Don't know. But the reality was it nearly broke John Deere, but 5 years later they, of course, were bigger than ever. And then if you look at World War II, I love this, the John Deere engineering regiment that came out of staff in America that were exempt from joining the military, they decided they would pull together their own regiments of engineers, bring them to Europe out of John Deere staff, and they were in the front line recovering tanks and things in northwest Europe. Now, you could say, and you could be cynical about that and say that was a conscious business decision. Maybe it was, don't know. But the net result was they were being a more than profit business before being a more than profit business became a thing. They were a responsible business anyway. I worked with SCA a lot, the world's greenest company, for a long time. And they, as you may know, have lots of consumer brands like Charmin, toilet roll and tampons, Tampax and things like that, paper-based products. And they resolved many years ago to plant 3 trees for every tree they ripped out of the ground to make pulp, to make paper. They became the world's greenest company. They own a lot of forests in Sweden and Canada and so on. But they resolved to do that way before more than profit was a thing. So I think we maybe need to start thinking about how we can, as human beings, adopt a more than profit, higher purpose set of values within ourselves, then look at how our businesses and organisations can do anything to contribute to that. That's that level. Whilst at the other level, we're looking at the systemic change, I think, that is required within Oxfordshire itself. It's a bow tie. If anybody knows the bow tie model, that's what it is. And you sort of meet in the middle. And I would argue lots of people are trying to do that. Some of them are on this talk right now. Lots of people are affecting change left, right and centre, and that's fantastic, absolutely brilliant. I've never been critical of any of that. What I feel, though, is that it is exactly the sort of iterative change that we can't really wait any longer for it to all galvanise and become coagulated properly, because I think we need to change faster than we currently are. And that requires systemic change.
Thanks, Steve. I know we've got Grant on the call, and Grant's been referenced a few times, and Grant certainly opened my eyes up to the importance of businesses operating with purpose, and Grant's a big advocate of the great work that B Corps do. Grant, you got a question for Steve?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think hello, Steve, and hello everybody else. I think Steve's a breath of fresh air. I think since I've known Steve, we've been involved in a few conversations, and certainly I was at that meeting, and I absolutely, he knows, I absolutely agree with the need to do what he's suggesting. I think the question that I've got for you, Steve, is that as someone that is involved, as you say, in some of this stuff, and we're making some progress, but you're absolutely right, it's not that, which is what you're talking about, is needed. I think what I've seen is the challenge with that is about, well, first of all, finding out what that common purpose is. You know, how do we sum up what this county needs and can do that's going to be appealing to everyone, and that's the problem. And then the other two ones, the other 2 points, which I think is really important, and again, from personal experience, is how do we get over the egos that get in the way and the ownership? Because I think that's the problem in the past. Well, you don't need me to say it, because you've said yourself, you use the V and you like to stir it up, but that actually sometimes, no, and I think that's a style that's very refreshing and sometimes needed. But equally, for the for some people that actually pushes them away, I think. And so how do we get everyone on board with a common purpose? How do we find a way of making sure we either satisfy people's egos or somehow bypass them? And that whole thing about whose it is, because people will immediately want to say, well, we're doing that. I mean, how many times have I heard that? I mean, we're doing that. You don't need to do that. Yeah. We're doing it, sort of thing. So there you go. It's a long question, sorry, but what do you think?
That's absolutely really great question. Clearly, I don't have all the answers. As you know, I'm a lone voice. I'm probably not a lone voice, but I'm certainly on my own. But I think the common purpose bit is really interesting. You may recall the beginning of that presentation last year. I came up with a line that said, "This is my county is me." And one of the things that I've been struck by in Oxfordshire, and I, as you know, have been in cities all over the world looking at how they change and how they affect all sorts of social change. But one of the things that really strikes me about Oxfordshire, I'm really annoyed about how many people say Oxford when they mean Oxfordshire as a county, by the way, but that's another thing. I think that the thing is the polarisation. It is the fact that when you go anywhere in the world, people have heard of, they've heard of Oxford, may not have heard of Banbury, but they've heard of Oxford. And they assume that we're all rich and we're all intelligent, right? So I've had that said to me in countless, latterly at the very end of last year in Italy. Somebody who didn't speak English said that to me when I told them where I was from. And so the common purpose for me, and this is not articulated as sexy words, but the common purpose has to be around this level of capability that Oxfordshire has got, one way or another, turned to resolving the issues that we have faced because of our polarisation. I don't think we're unique, but we're in a fairly rare breed of cities and counties in the country and in the world that has that level of polarisation across everywhere. So how can we become famous for being able to turn that around? And that for me is the central challenge. So when you look at an organisation like the Oxfordshire Community Foundation, who are doing amazing work, and that's fantastic, but when they have been talking about social issues, that's great, but that alienates a great deal of the county. I haven't got any social issues. I'm perfectly happy as I am, thank you and good night. So how do we talk about social change in a way that is inclusive, where everybody can lie in their beds at night and feel good about themselves? Well, a lot of people will say, well, that's a bit of a hippie way of looking at it, Steve. I don't believe it is. I think it's really, and particularly because of COVID, maybe now actually is the moment. Lots of people are saying that. Lots of people saying we should find the new normal. I actually don't believe in the new normal at all, any more I believe in going back to normal. But I think now is probably the time to sit there and galvanise action. So that was the first, I think the first thing, I don't know what our common purpose should be, but I think a vision for the future of Oxfordshire should rest in, this is my county is me. I can only take out from the county what I put in. And as I said in that talk, I imagine, I always have to think of an individual because I'm like that, but I imagine somebody lying in the street on St Giles in the middle of Oxford in the pouring rain with a styrofoam cup, and they haven't got anything, and they might have more to contribute to the county than the rest of us put together. It's just they don't know it and we don't know it. No one's engineered that. So how can you create that real systemic, and that is systemic change. The egos bit is fascinating. Just before 18th of March, I was involved in a video conference with the global CEO and C-suite of a global enterprise organisation, where I had been working for the previous 3 months, building a business case for a profound strategic change in that organisation worldwide. On the Monday, it really hit that we were heading towards lockdown. Lots of things were starting to change, and this particular organisation was having to affect a lot of really chaotic change in all sorts of programs they were delivering, everything else. I didn't think that video conference call was going to happen on the 18th of March, but it did, and the entire C-suite was on it. And at the end of it, they not only approved the strategic change to be implemented immediately, which is kind of good for me, that's great, but the last words the CEO, the global CEO, the last words he said was, we are in a shitload of disruption now, so let's make some more, but let's make it planned. And I thought that was really enlightening. Now, there's a guy and a team of people that have huge egos. They are at the top of the pile in a massive organisation worldwide, embarking on something really scary in terms of change, which I've engineered with them, saying that. So he was prepared to let go, because we've all got egos, but there comes a point where perhaps the thing that satisfies our egos most is letting go of it. And I've seen that, I'm sure you have too, with leaders in all sorts of organisations. And you take that down to the smallest business. Take a very small business and say to the guy, the girl that started it, you need to do things differently. Get out of your comfort zone, lose your confirmation biases, and do something different. They are about as protected as it's possible to get. They started it. It's their egos 100%, isn't it? So I think that transition has to say to the, so say, leadership of the county, the way you've been doing it is all good, and you can be protectionist about that if you want. That's fantastic. That's really great. But I have to tell you, you'll be flying a plane that is likely, it may not crash, the wings might not fall off, but it won't be sky high in the right way. Or you can let a bit of it go, use all of your skills and knowledge and expertise and everything else that you've got. And I'd say this to anybody in the council, deploy all of that capability, accept the loss marginally to your ego, but be associated with something much better. And I think that answers really, in a very loose way, answers the ego and the ownership bit.
Thanks, Steve.
Let it go.
That helps. That's useful, Grant. Brilliant. Steve, we're bang on 12:30. We've got 2 questions, so if everybody's happy to hang on, if we could just run over by 5 minutes, that'd be great. First up, Joni Mitchell. You put yourself back on mute again, Joanna.
Okay, there we go. Sorry.
Thank you.
Hi everybody. Just wanted to ask, from your experience, if you could give an example maybe of a county that you think is doing it well, because obviously some of the examples are not necessarily counties, whereas we are talking about counties. So I wondered if you've got any examples of that you think are approaching this in the right way.
Okay, so the short answer in the UK, when I think of counties, is no. And they're all struggling in the same but different ways to the UK. And I'm not a detailed knowledge expert on counties in the UK. What I do know is that if you look at federated states in other countries, and some of those are city-states, so if you look at city-states in Germany, if you look at what's been going on in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, look at what happened in Iceland back in 2009, post all sorts of scandals and elections and things like that, and the idea of continuous referenda, which they've deployed really well. I think in Buenos Aires as a city, they've been deploying that, but they're now going to roll that out across the whole country. I think that's, so in the UK, I think the problem with the county, and I've said this in a couple of things that I've written, I think the problem is the county has become something that it didn't start being. Any county, as an entity, the county has become a changed thing. It has become a bureaucratic governance that people come into and move out of freely, because we do, that's the way it works. And so it's become nothing but, I think, a way of governing a bunch of people and infrastructure and schools and all those other practical things that you need to have. I don't think counties per se have any degree of equity or agency with the people that live in them. And I don't believe that they're anything more in terms of aspiration than just keeping the wheels on. And that's fine, that's okay. However, if you look at cities, Manchester would be a great example. If you look at Birmingham, they're both really good examples. Parts of London, if you look at the turnaround in, say, Brixton, or if you look at the turnaround in St Paul's in Bristol, many years ago after the riots, if you remember those, then you can start to see how you can coagulate society much more effectively. I personally, and I'm apolitical, but I personally believe that we should move towards much greater devolution as a nation. It's odd to say that, given the fact that right now we're in the middle of the biggest sort of central government, almost Orwellian, as somebody wrote the other day, sort of way of running the country by necessity right now. But I think if you gave counties and the people who are the so-say leadership of counties greater ownership of the way in which they engage with everybody that's in that county, and you started to get creative about that, and I think you need to get creative and get human about it, then I think you can start a process of change. But when I'm not sitting here to be critical of anybody, but when I sat and listened at some event last year to somebody delivering the county's transport strategy, it's all good. It's all practically fantastic. But there was no song to it at all. Nothing at all. And in fact, at that same, and I will say this for dramatic effect in a way, when somebody piped up and said that there needs to be greater understanding between bus drivers and cyclists, and then we would start to engineer that through better cycleways and all that good stuff. That's fantastic. That's really great. But I have personal, direct, very close experience of somebody being killed on a bike by a bus. And so I felt bad about that as a practical sort of good strategic initiative. But I felt bad because it didn't really think about humanity. And I think over everything else, and all my work in the civil society and all my work with charities over the years and charity governance, particularly with NCVO and Charities Commission, the Ministry for Civil Society, all my work in that area speaks to the need for greater humanity. And I don't think Oxfordshire has that. I don't believe any county in the UK has that. I think parts of counties do, but I don't think counties as a whole, because they are a bureaucratic machine. They're there to keep the wheels in.
Brilliant, Steve. Thank you. Right, final question. Darren Elsey. You're on, Darren.
I'm on. There we go. Yeah, how are you doing, Steve?
All right, how are you?
Very well, very well. My question is, or it really was, is obviously you want to introduce this change and have a purpose, which sort of needs a collective common vision of where you want the county to go. Yeah. But for when I meet people who in all walks of life, there's still the mindset. We still have a mindset and a message that is given out that obviously profit and materialistic things are what measures success. The big house, the smart car, the labels, and it's not. You don't hear of the people who are successful because they give. Yet you get such a lot personally from giving, but you're judged on your car, your house, your business, your profit, and so that needs a bit of it. So if you want to give back to Oxfordshire, that whole mindset needs to change fundamentally in society. And it needs to, once you've, if you haven't got a lot, and then you start to get success, and do you adopt that kind of materialistic thing, and you lose that vision which you had and those beliefs which you had in the first place?
So, within that, what you're describing is the difference between, at a very basic level, is the difference between people that give to charity and people that don't. There's the people that say, on one level, there are the people that say, I'm all right, Jack, fuck off, I'm not interested, I've never had the need for charity, I don't care about, I was saying to somebody the other day, I've never needed charity, I don't care. I do, but imagine that as a comment. I don't care, because it's never touched me. I've never needed it, ever, not once, right up until my wife gets cancer, which as everybody knows she did. And then I become acutely aware of cancer charities. Or my mum needs to go into a care home, so I become acutely aware of care homes. And so until charity, and I'm being really sort of cynical about this because of your question, you're absolutely right. There are people that sit there and say, I'm all right, Jack. And they don't even have to be rich. The person that stole a bottle of hand sanitizer from my mother-in-law's hand in a supermarket in Shrewsbury at the beginning of lockdown, I don't believe that person was a multi-millionaire sort of Uber oligarch or anything like that. I think they were just a selfish person. And society is full of selfish people. However, if you go back to the concept of the village, and this is something that I was working on in the EU back in sort of 2012, 13, 14, if you look at the urban village and you start to see what happens even in housing estates, when people start to see that it is better not to be selfless, you have to be a certain type of person to be entirely selfless, for sure. But when people start to see the shift the groundswell starts to change and people are wanting their environments and the people around them, they want well of them rather than ill of them, it's a very basic human instinct, then you can start to self-moderate, self-evaluate. I don't doubt for a minute that part of Boris's speech the other day on Sunday night, his announcement, was about us self-policing. They want us to be able to say, hang on a minute, there's somebody walking in a field and they shouldn't be there, or there's somebody camping in a field, they shouldn't be. They want us to self-police. And I think that's a bad thing because it's a route to anarchy. On the other hand, I think it's a good thing because I think we should. I think, as I think I've said to you and others, if we were in a village in the middle of the 13th century and my son steals bread from your table, you and me will have a chat about it. I shall chastise my son. I shall pay you back in potatoes for your loaf of bread, and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. We don't need the police. We don't need higher authority. We don't need any of that. We'll just resolve it ourselves. Now, I think we're never, ever going to create a society where there aren't people in it who are entirely selfish, 100% only in it for themselves, only in it for the profits. But I think we can also see businesses who may want to do more, but just can't see. And I was saying to somebody again this morning, if you make door hinges and you run a small business and your profit is negligible at the end of the year, but at least you're working for yourself and you're making door hinges, it must be very difficult to sit there and think, right, I can adopt a higher purpose for my business. However, competitive advantage has always, when you think about it, been based on some kind of purposeful advantage over somebody else. My washing machine is going to clean the customer's pants much more effectively than your washing machine. My purpose is to provide cleaner pants. I'm using pants because of your business. But the point is there is competitiveness in there. So I don't think you can get rid of competitiveness. And in fact, when you think about what Professor Colin Mayer talks about in terms of the role of corporate purpose, I think he's absolutely right. I just don't think he's right for everyone. I also believe that if you start to bring in legislation that forces businesses to be purposeful, then you're going to create an absolute shitstorm. However, the principle is right. I don't think I've answered your question particularly. You can't stop everybody being selfish. What you can do is make people want to be less selfish.
Is that okay, Darren? Brilliant. Well, thank you, Steve, and I appreciate everybody hanging on. If you want to hear more from Steve, then Steve, I'm sure, will be putting more content out on LinkedIn, and Steve will also be joining us at Bio from the 2nd to 4th of June. So thank you, Steve.